Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's, the March DevSecOps Bunch session, our monthly webinar on all things DevSecOps, where we bring in experts from around the industry to share their knowledge, their best practices, their data, which is what today's all about. So today's session will be data-driven performance, benchmarking web and mobile DevSecOps best practices. Very excited to have my friend Warren Kopp here from Coalfire, and he's got some awesome data that comes from the annual Coalfire report that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So Warren, can you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm a consultant with Coalfire. I focus on application security, and that runs the entire gamut from application pen testing through program building, threat modeling, all the pieces along the way. I came into being a consultant after building internal application security programs. So I've been consulting on this for about 4 years now.
Well, fantastic. It's great to have you here. For those who don't know me, I'm Brian Reed. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer at NowSecure. You might wonder what one of those things do. I've been doing mobile and mobile strategy since the day of BlackBerry. I joined NowSecure about 5 years ago. And I'm the MC and the host for our DevSecOps bunch, as well as one of our primary evangelists in the marketplace as well. And I've got some really cool data I'm going to dumpster dive through today along with Warren. So a little introduction about NowSecure. So NowSecure has been in business since 2009. We are an all-in-one mobile-first, mobile-only business. We provide automated testing, pen testing, training, consulting services, all kinds of great stuff. We do a lot of work in the standards community, building specifications. We do a lot of work in the open source community, building open source tools. You may know Frida and Radari. And of course, we work with all of the different DevSecOps vendors in terms of integrating into their infrastructure to give you faster running pipelines. NowSecure is well recognized for our leadership. As I said earlier, we are the OWASP God Mode sponsor and spec leader for the OWASP mobile spec. It just went through an update, OWASP MASVS v2. We're also an authorized lab if you want to get ADA or IOXT certified. Many of the leaders in the tech community rely on us for our security strategy, and we do pen testing and security testing for them along with the carriers. And we are well recognized by our customers in the market. We serve basically every industry you can imagine. To a large extent, it's the regulated industries and the customer-facing businesses, right? So financial services, retail, hospitality, travel, and so on and so forth. We work with some really cool stuff like Tesla cars. We also work with the biggest vendors in the world like Google and Microsoft. So we're excited to be talking to you today. And with that, I'd like to have Warren introduce Coalfire to you.
Coalfire is a great consultancy. A lot of folks know us for our compliance history and our compliance analysis. Along with that, we have a great pen testing arm that goes everything from network to application pen testing. I am part of our application security division that we're here to help you on everything you need for an AppSec program. We have plenty of experts who have built programs, matured them over time, laid in the groundwork to roll with it from the very first steps and all the way to the highest integrations at the highest complexity and maturity levels. So we're here to help with things like that. And we have clients across every set of industry vertical. We have a federal government division. We're here to help, and we have experience with a lot of the biggest things down to your normal everyday mom and pop business. We can cover every bit of ground. We can supply whatever application security gap you have in your program and help you build it to the next level.
Well, very good. So I want to remind folks, we are recording today's presentation. We're also going to be sharing, within a few days after the event, we will be sharing a copy of the slides and the recording. We're also taking live questions as we go, so we encourage you to do the Q&A that you'll see in your Zoom tab. And those questions, Warren and I will answer at the end. If there's any questions we miss at the end, we'll follow up with you offline to make sure you get your answers. So we're here to have a data-driven conversation. The last couple of months, we've been kind of hands-on with various components in the pipeline at the security layer, the policy layer, the crypto layer, and so forth. And today we really want to focus on the data-driven world. So when you look at world-class organizations in the DevOps space, there's a number of well-known brands that people often refer to. Netflix and Amazon have the ability to go basically from submit to prod in like 90 minutes with a really fast cycle. They do rapid iterations in their pipelines. Coca-Cola, Uber, Starbucks. Uber's interesting because Uber actually has approximately 10,000 developers in their mobile ecosystem. And those developers are not just building an app for one app store, they're doing over as many as 150 builds for different versions of the Uber apps that run in different countries that have different feature sets. So they got a really large, wide scale, very sophisticated program, but they run at a very rapid pace, leveraging the best of DevSecOps. What they all have in common is they all measure data. They all focus on incremental improvements, automate everything you can, measure, tune, evolve to the best you can, and that gets you to those rapid cycles where it allows you to do high quality innovation quickly. So as we think about data and a data-driven approach and wanting to sort of understand from a benchmarking perspective or a peer group perspective, we need to think about what are kind of the 5 key things we want to know about data. So the first thing is, what goals and problems are you trying to achieve? What problems are you trying to solve? What goals are you trying to achieve? Maybe it's you're trying to move from a monthly release cadence to a bi-weekly release cadence to a weekly release cadence. Maybe it's that you want to start your shift left cycle and enable your developers to do a little more security work so they're not all waiting for the security team to do it later. Whatever those are, try to identify some metrics that go with it. What are you measuring today? And are you measuring the right things that align with your goals, right? We often find that people are measuring the wrong things that don't align with their goals. Or they're not even measuring the things that actually matter. How do you compare to others? So today we're going to do a bunch of benchmarking data so you can see how many different organizations are reporting their performance metrics and how they've evolved over time. And there's some super awesome data. We're going to walk through web apps, mobile apps. We're going to walk through DevSecOps pipeline performance. And then how are your measurements changing as you progress, right? So in your earlier stages of maturity, there might be a few simple metrics. As you get more mature, it'll be more sophisticated. One of the things near the tail end we're going to do is I'm going to show you sort of the 8 top metrics that our high-performing customers tend to measure in their pipelines from a mobile DevSecOps perspective. So we got our data understanding. We all wish we were as great as some of these other organizations. What we want to do is really dumpster dive now into a whole lot of data coming from the industry and see what we can learn from those so we can figure out how to evolve our AppSec programs and our DevSecOps programs. So I'll hand it over to you, Warren. You guys have a great report you just did an update on.
Absolutely. In collaborating with NowSecure, this includes plenty of extra data that we necessarily would not have had on our own. But given the breadth of our clientele, we can go out there and we can analyze risk and trends over time. And what we do is we assemble that into a report to have this conversation with the wider world around us. Next slide. So you can see over here, there's an improvement from internal actors, but the change still is necessary to keep going. Internal risk is always a problem. I've had many, many conversations with folks over the years who don't even count this as a part of their issue. But you have to understand that the vectors still exist as a risk to your pipeline. Either the internal pipeline is exposed to bad actors, or there's risk internally because it's not solid. There's an entire possibility that your pipeline is barely held together on a single desktop under somebody's desk somewhere, that you're not really considering that risk as a part of the risk to your program. So these factors here come into these metrics that we're showing of where does the risk lie and how do you consider it? Next slide. Another thing we talk about is cloud service providers. So as folks are maturing, as they're aging out of that waterfall model that once a cycle release every 6, 9, 12 months, however it goes, they're also migrating their organization into these more agile, more modern cloud service providers. And we're comparing the risk that comes in that cloud service provider as the same as in an enterprise and what that looks like over time. Cloud service providers are often built from the ground up on these more modern delivery mechanisms where they're assuming that they're going to be continuously pushing code out. They're continuously making changes to their products and cycles for their customers. Whereas enterprises have a much longer cycle. So their risk level and their risk tolerance comes in differently because of change controls, because of change management, because of just the pace. In some of these businesses, it's still hinging upon a single person or department as a gatekeeper. So they can't change as quickly. So their risks over time don't necessarily change as dramatically as they do in these more modern providers. Next slide. So once we talk about what this means in terms of how the risk gets applied and how it gets counted is you start to learn company size has a lot to do with it. Small companies have a huge amount of high risk over time because they're smaller. They can't be as agile and they can't be as focused across the opportunity in their environment as some of these larger organizations are. Because the larger organizations are more modern and usually looking towards becoming so, they have a lot more folks focused on every different part of the web of their organization in terms of minimizing that risk or at least charting it and asking more questions. So that's where you see these primary drivers here in reduction of high risk. Cloud migration enforces more modern practices than those once a cycle releases, however long the recycle is. The increased testing cadence can come in every step, not just when they're ready to release, which is definitely a feature of older organizations, less agile. They know their system and they want to keep repeating it. Whereas in this modern environment, there's a lot of opportunity to move those things earlier in the cycle. Add security testing in before release as it goes to QA. Push those things earlier in the cycle to have better conversations and build better relationships with security folks rather than just waiting until the end and tacking it on as an end of goal process. Next slide. So with all of this risk, with this charting of things back and forth, you get to see that there is a different story in different industries. And that's, I think, part of where we're going to go with some of this conversation today is as you start to chart your risk, as you start to build your metrics, you can build a specific program related to you and your customers and your business processes. When we built out those 5 key questions earlier, you want to compare with other folks in your industry, because if you're not in the streaming video industry, maybe comparing yourself to Netflix and their rollouts and their metrics isn't as relevant to you if you're in healthcare or an insurance vertical. So it's important to understand your risks and where your opportunities go to derive those metrics, make those changes, and put security quicker and more often into the cycle. Next slide. And here's where I hand it off to Brian.
Sorry about that. A little bit of user error there. Back here. All right. So we've looked at Coalfire data. Now we worked together with Coalfire on their annual industry report. I'm going to take you down into the path of the mobile data that NowSecure has been collecting for a long time. So mobilerisktracker.nowsecure.com is a source. And inside here, where we've got 5 years of benchmark data built out, we're looking at sort of the top 5,000 mobile apps in the mobile risk tracker. We're looking at the top 5,000 apps that you see in the commercial app stores. Now, the data I'm going to roll into next is the mega data set that takes all of that, but actually expands that to over 50,000 apps. And those apps that have been analyzed in the last 90 days. These are apps coming from the public app stores. Now, the reason we're using the public app stores is we've got a data set of millions of public apps. Let's go look at the most popular application categories, and let's go look at the risk profile of that mass data of commercial apps in the App Store. So what we did is we've kind of sliced this into 13 verticals, and I've kind of organized the data here from left to right. And I've done it based on score. So kind of like a FICO credit score or grades in school, we score applications on a score of 0 to 100, where 100 is a high quality application and 0 is a train wreck. Generally, the scoring pattern is loaded in a way that it's kind of like when you were at school. So 90 to 100 is an A, and 80 to 90 is a B, and 70 to 80 is a C. So what you're going to see here is, at best, mobile application developers across all these industries are scoring in the mid-70s. And it's interesting to see that automotive and high tech are on the high end on the left, and financial services, which is typically heavily regulated, is kind of on the lower end on the right. It's also interesting to see that by industry, they're fairly similar. There isn't a lot of spread between the high 60s and the mid 70s going across this. So as we look at each of these industry verticals, there's generally 500 to 1,000 apps in each of these 13 slices here. Some of the app groups like gig economy or social media are much larger because there's just so many of them. So we can think about it by industry. As Warren said, it's important to think about what's relevant in your own industry. From there, we're going to take a look at risk distribution within the verticals. So we're using CVSS scoring in our analysis. So what this basically is showing us is the distribution of CVSS high medium, and low, and then very low is the stuff that's near zero. And so your CVSS scores distribution across industry. So when you look at this, of course, if banking and travel and retail are the lowest total scores, they have the highest risk. It would correlate that they would have many higher CVSS high findings in their distribution, as you can see here. There's some interesting things you can see here going across the group. So for example, if you look at IoT, that might pop out to your eyes, you'll see that the batch of IoT vendors, the 500-600 IoT vendors that we're monitoring that are mobile connected IoT apps, they actually have fewer highs, CVSS high scoring things. Their distribution is mostly in the medium category in the middle. Let's also see that the gig economy has pretty bad data throughout. Notice how big the medium is, and they've got almost no very low. What's interesting about this distribution, when you actually look at the finding data that's generated, and these are all verified findings, so there's no false positives. We're not talking about like 1,000 crazy findings from a static source code scanner. When you look across these, the industries in general only had between 1 and 3 mobile applications that got perfect scores of 100, that had no CVSS scored findings. So overall, when we look at this, you've got 85 to 90% of all apps in the app stores have one or more vulnerability that would violate the OWASP mobile MASVS specification. And when you look at the overall distribution here, it's pretty rough. The number of high CVSS high exploitable vulnerabilities, I think we all would agree, are too high. And there's reasons for that, and we're going to talk about those reasons and what we can do to move across them. Now, I'm always asked, well, what are the worst ones? So in slicing into the categories, if you use the OWASP MASVS, there are 8 sets of controls in the OWASP MASVS requirements. And what I did is I filled out the 5 worst. So storage and crypto, 50% of all applications tested in this data set and the broader mobile app store data set have insecure storage and crypto. That is amazing. That means that on your phone, half of those applications are storing data insecurely. 48%, just a tiny bit less, have insecure network. Mobile applications are notoriously difficult to write to handle network communication. Cert pinning is hard to do. There isn't default security turned on with SSL. So it's easy for developers to make mistakes when they're encoding it, and they're not always using the default security controls, which is why you have a fairly high insecure network. Insecure coding practices are you're leaving debug code on, leaving credentials in the code, all those kinds of hygiene things that kind of are notorious everywhere else. And then on iOS and Android, the apps are reversible, so reverse engineering becomes a big issue. But the good news is that only about 1/3 of the apps are dangerously reversible, so organizations are doing better and better. So we've kind of sliced through this data. We've looked at web from Warren and Coalfire, and we've looked at NowSecure data for mobile specifically. Now we want to dumpster dive into some DevSecOps data. So I'm going to cover some IDC data, and then Warren's got some more data from the Coalfire report to kind of round out, when we look at it from a DevSecOps perspective, what does the world look like? Now, the data we looked at so far had to do with where the risks and the vulnerabilities were. This is going to walk us down what are the tooling and techniques and strategies DevSecOps teams are applying. So let's take a look at a few of these. So what are the stages where organizations are incorporating application security testing? And so what you can see, as we've seen in the industry by and large, is the classic shift left, right? So it's impressive to see some 16% in design and 15% in planning and 20% in development and so on and so forth. So it's good to see the shift left is occurring substantially. Kind of amazing how many are in release in blue. And so what we're seeing here is that organizations are definitely making progress, and they're looking at many different places to inject application security capabilities. Now, frequency directly correlates to a DevOps orientation or a DevSecOps orientation. So when you think about high frequency development release cycles, that's one thing. You also need to think about monitoring apps in production. So we want to look at rate of testing pre-production, then rate of testing in production. So you can see that there's an increased rate of testing in production going on in the marketplace. Now, the inverse of when do you test is when do you find the vulnerabilities? So I think it's kind of interesting that people are finding vulnerabilities in design and planning. That must mean there's good quality code reviews and code coaching going on. You would expect a lot of them to find them in development and testing. The good news is that many fewer are now found in release and production time. The whole reason for DevSecOps and the shift left notion is you want to catch as many security risks and fix them before you release. So we're seeing a good distribution here on the left. If you look at this data from a couple of years ago, everything to the left of testing was much smaller. So there's been a dramatic ramp in testing during planning and development as compared to before. Now, when we ask organizations, when IDC asked organizations, so when you look at that in your integrating tools and you're evolving what you're doing, what are the different kinds of practices? Because there is no silver bullet in DevSecOps. So you can see there's like 10 different things that they asked about. So integrating security scanning is number one. The good news is 50% of the world does that. The bad news is 50% of the world doesn't. That's a really easy way to dramatically increase your coverage and your frequency. Leveraging SBOM to track vulnerabilities, that was higher than I would have expected in terms of general SBOM adoption. Code reviews, yay. Code reviews is probably why we're finding more in design and planning, which is really great. And policy-driven security controls are on the expansion as well. Between things that GitHub has done around GitHub Advanced Security and NowSecure has done with the policy engine, you see more and more tools able to deploy policy and automation controls in there. And by pushing policy in, then you free the developers and security teams to operate quickly. And only when something's out of bound of policy does it need to be addressed. That kind of dramatically reduces noise, allows the teams to focus, and gives effectively faster pipelines. Now, when we think about the barrier, right? So DevSecOps, we're a classic shift left. We're trying to enable the developers. What are the barriers in helping them move through? And if you're in this space and you're looking at this, of course, developers are very frustrated with slow scanning processes, right? I have heard of SaaS scans taking days to crawl an entire repo. And traditionally, a DAST scan is really something more like a pen test that can take hours or days as well. So looking towards automation that runs in a friction-free environment is clearly something developers would prefer, and they're frustrated by the slow path. Coding expertise is also very true. We find in the mobile space, for example, most developers haven't been trained on secure coding techniques. So there are lots of training programs out there that organizations can leverage to overcome the security. There's proactive training and there's just-in-time training. We'll look at that a little bit later. False positives, that's clearly the complaint. Using static source code scanning generates false positives. You want to try to find a better approach than that. And it's interesting that you have insecure coding expertise and lack of coding skills. They kind of go together here. You combine those two, and you're at about 30%, which is just below the slow security scanning. So clearly training is something we want to be doing. What types of changes are you making to address future breaches? So this is leaning into the future. So the last slide said training was a barrier. It's very interesting to see training as the number one on this particular survey. Coordination, cooperation, partnering, collaboration, building security champion programs comes through. We talked about policy management, and then of course, everybody's working on software supply chain now. And if you're not, that's a great quick hit win. Bring in an SCA tool, open source or commercial tool, and start monitoring your software supply chain. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit you can clean up in your environment. So as we get to the end of the data here, so what are the 5 most important tools organizations have deployed? It's interesting to see DAST is first, then SCA, IaaS, SAST, and mobile application security testing. Now, obviously, the population of people that were asked were people doing web as well as mobile. In the web space, typically DAST, SCA, IaaS, and SAST are separate products or tools you might buy from one or multiple vendors. And the mobile space, they're all in one. So mobile tools tend to have SAST, DAST, IaaS, and SCA all bundled into them as a single thing. And so that's why we can see that as kind of an independent listing. So with that, I want to hand it back to Warren to talk about some of the use cases that they're seeing in the data set and what this tells us.
So a lot of that data informs everything I've seen and encouraged folks to do since I joined application security, and that's push things further left earlier in the release cycle. Those big spikes you used to see around release, those were those last stage check-in, oh, we're going to run a pen test and then ignore the results so we can push to production. or we'll run a pen test and we'll fix a couple of highs just to reduce risk and satisfy an auditor before we move forward. What we want to do is automate as much of any of these processes as we can as early into the cycle as possible. That's where Brian's talking about code review being a huge win. Threat modeling comes in an earlier layer even than that to bring the entire team in to understand how things are orchestrated, why they're being built the way they are, and then have that analysis before you put the pieces together of where it can go wrong and sideways. On this chart, you see the changes over time of where folks intend to be implementing more automation and where they have or don't know where they're at in the future. And there's big things here. And if somewhere down in the middle, you see identified misconfigured services and things like that. Those are those huge things we see as pen testers as we come in, where it's security misconfigurations all along the board. And cycling back to where we talked earlier, that's an internal risk as well as an external one. Once you deploy it, there's the risk of, are you on an old framework? Are you on an old version? Things like that. Simple misconfigurations on that level, out of date things. Internally, those risks still apply as well. As you integrate more of these SaaS, DAST, IaaS tools earlier in the pipeline, you have to make sure they're maintained. You have to make sure that they are acknowledged and paid attention to with the same degree as you would with a production app out on the internet. It's just a different layer of consideration to make sure that your entire program is healthy from the earliest conception through all of the automation you can bring in. A lot of that comes to do with building relationships across teams that have traditionally been siloed. The folks who own the production of those tools aren't necessarily the ones taking in the output of those tools. A lot of times it's been, let's kick a report over across a wall and tell them they have to remediate these number of things in a certain timeline, and then don't offer that support. There's huge opportunity for building those bridges and relationships to offer that support and say, look, we don't want to waste your time with false positives. Those are a huge problem for you. They're a waste of effort for us. What can we do to make that better going forward and build a relationship around that interaction? My success as a security professional has come from not dictating that we need to change things, looking for opportunity and asking for opportunity in the future of where we can collaborate. Cycling back to bringing in that automation in those CI/CD pipelines, one of my early consultant gigs just blew my mind because there was a gentleman there who was really aggressive at trying to figure out the next way to handle things. He wasn't happy to deal with where things were today and what their tooling was today. He wanted to change and move that needle differently. When I look at some of these opportunities for the future in automation, I think of that gentleman often because he took the exception process, which was, we have a finding in a certain tool or a certain process, but we're not going to fix it. He automated that into their build pipeline with an automation timeline to kick things back out if they hadn't been updated in a certain period of time. So if it was a certain finding in 60 days, it would allow that build to go forward for 60 days. Once it hit that mark, if there was no update, it would drop that build and report to all the stakeholders, this is why it failed. This exception needs to be renewed, mitigated, whatever, but this is a part of our process. Those aggressive changes to what you can do in the future is how these automation DevSecOps use cases are going to get better going forward. Folks looking for opportunities that may not have been built yet, but make sense for your organization. Next slide. So I've said it before, and I'm going to keep saying it because this is the trend I've noticed in my career, and I'm excited to be a part of it going forward, is folks are getting better at this and trying to be more secure over time. They're trying to make their processes more agile. They're trying to make things earlier in the cycle. So once they get to release readiness, they click that button and they deploy just like the big boys because they know they've hit their marks along the way. Next slide. So backing up the anecdotes and the data that we have here, it's going to take new approaches. It's going to take aggressive introspection to understand what makes sense for your business, for your customers, for your developers, for your teams, to build the right use cases, to build the right automations, to make them more successful. If you can change the internal structure, you can build those bridges of collaboration, places where it did not exist in the past. It's going to increase your speed. It won't in the first week, But by the first quarter, the first half, the first year, once you've built relationships, you're going to find better synergies between different folks to make things get that goal quicker and get it easier over time and have newer ideas, because you're all pushing one another to find what you can do different, what you can do better, how you can do it faster, how you can be more effective.
All righty, so we are done with the data. So now we've seen application security issues and evolution and metrics over time from the web and mobile perspective. We've seen what's going on with DevSecOps adoption and the evolution of tools, training strategies. Now we want to put it to work. So every month we get into a putting it to work section. So we're going to jump into our usual pipeline diagram. Now in your organization, you probably have a pipeline picture that looks something like this, right? So you establish some company standards and set policies up front. You train your team proactively. You generate requirements for the apps you're building. You write some code, commit, build, test, rinse, and repeat, our little cyclical diagram in the middle. Then you move into staging, prod, and monitor in production. And again, we noticed earlier, people are testing not just in pre-production, but in production always. And as you look through the cycle, obviously, there's a bunch of core technology running in the middle that's enabling the machine to run. So if we look at actually trying to apply this, one way to think about this from a mobile perspective is to think about mobile AppSec as a service, right? So I was inspired the way Warren was talking about cloud and the movement to the cloud and leveraging cloud infrastructure and resources. And there's a zillion reasons why cloud can be better than on-prem. And so when we think of these cloud as a service, platform as a service, IaaS as a service, infrastructure as a service, and so forth, we want to be thinking about mobile AppSec as a service. And we're actually able to do that today. So it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of a 5 or 6 step process, right? So you want to set policies up front and deploy them through automated controls. You want to do some proactive security training, and I'll give you an example of what that means. So NowSecure Academy was created with NowSecure in a joint partnership with the US Air Force as part of the BESPIN project, and we're able to public source it. So NowSecure Academy is free to anybody. And the goal in that project was to create developer skilling courses and pen tester skilling courses, along with architecture component, so that their web and mobile teams could build and deploy faster, achieving the federal government ATO requirements, the authority to operate requirements that are necessary, and do that at a rapid pace of innovation. I was at an event this week, and there were some other federal people at the table, and they were all wishing and dreaming that their departments were as efficient and as effective as what's going on at BESPIN in the US Air Force. But they took a proactive and reactive training approach with just in time. With the proactive, what we figured out with the Air Force studying it was going back to those 5 most common vulnerability areas that I listed earlier. If you give developers a 30-minute training course on writing code for storage for iOS and Android, give them a 20-minute training course for network, give them a 20-minute training course or 30-minute training course for code quality best practices, and a short class on resiliency, takes them 2 hours to take those short classes when they have a little bit of spare time, you will dramatically increase the quality of your application and the velocity of delivery. Because most mobile developers and web developers, frankly, don't know security, and these are just the crib sheets. When on Android, use network security controls, NSC. When on iOS, use ATS. Now, with the policy controls and the training in place, you still want an automated pipeline. So you want automated security testing. And the mobile world, as we talked earlier with MAST, that's actually combining SAST, DAST, IAST, API-SEC all in one test run, and doing that running in 10, 15, 20 minutes, providing that fast feedback loop and generating tickets back to the developer. In this world, those tickets are fed to the developer with embedded remediation instructions in them, code samples, line of code, all that other great stuff. So you test fast, you provide fast feedback loops, you provide them material and knowledge and training and sample code so they can fix it fast. That's how you get acceleration. And as Warren mentioned earlier, there are critical applications that must have compliance testing or pen testing. So you need to factor planned continuous pen testing through that cycle for those higher risk applications, or those applications that must meet some sort of compliance mandate. And so we've got hundreds of customers that are doing this, and this is how they've accelerated their pipeline. This is how they get faster releases with the higher quality in it, is thinking about it as AppSec as a service within their pipeline. Now, I'm often asked, when I'm out doing training, well, what are those metrics we should be measuring? What do your more mature customers measure? So I'm going to give you some quick metrics kind of running through our pipeline diagram. I want to remind you we're taking Q&A at the end, so stick those questions in the Q&A and Warren and I will answer them. So OWASP has the best set of standards for mobile application development and security testing in the OWASP MASVS. So what percentage of your teams and your employees are using the OWASP standards or specification in your organization? You could start with one team and grow adoption over time. Our inbound requests for training and tooling, policy-driven tooling automation around OWASP is just exploding as more and more organizations are focusing on that. What percentage of your staff has completed training in some way, shape, or form? You should have some proactive training, which is an example of like the 4 top things you want to train people on that I just mentioned before. The number of security requirements created and completed in your pipeline. You should be creating security requirements in the same way you're creating product feature requirements, and track those requirements creation and closing of those tickets if they've been completed. Obviously, the number and severity of issues found and the mean time to repair of those issues going through your cycle, because obviously you want to decrease the number of issues found and you want to shorten the amount of time to repair, because that's how you get speed. And you need to factor in the severity level. And that leads you to some of the classic DevOps metrics that apply to mobile web and AppSec as well: close rate, dwell time, regression state, et cetera, et cetera. I'm an old QA hound for a while, so that was a big part of my world. You also want to track the number and severity of issues found via the combination of manual and automated. As you evolve your team, what you want to have happen is you want to have automation catch the low-hanging fruit anywhere possible, so that when you get to the manual pen testing, all the simple stuff's already been found and your pen testers are focusing on the more complex pieces. And if you're going for compliance, you want to make sure that any compliant-oriented issues are caught and fixed through automation, so that the compliance greases right through and you get out quickly to meet the compliance mandates as well. And to finalize it all, of course, you want to monitor your defect escape rate. That's what security issues are found when you push into production. So you don't have to measure all these today. You may or may not be measuring these today, but this is what our best-in-class customers tell us they're measuring, some or all of these kinds of issues. You'll notice a lot of them may fit your AppSec program already. You'll notice a number of them will fit your QA program already. And if you have a training program, they might fit that as well. So I encourage you to take advantage of these DevSecOps metrics to make yourself successful. So Warren and I are going to transition. We're going to share a little more information about additional resources for you, kind of summarize where we are. So Warren, when we think about helping customers together, what does Coalfire ultimately bring to the table?
We bring breadth of experience. When you hire a consultant, you want somebody who's seen a lot more than what exists inside your organization. So we, as I said at the top, we work for a lot of very large organizations all the way through to very small organizations and everything in between. So we've seen a lot of stuff that's the cutting edge modern development practices, and we've seen a lot of stuff as folks try and mature their life cycle through. And we offer support at different layers of that for different folks, for different organizations, depending on what they need. Is it pen testing and application security consulting? We can help you build your program. We can help you build your threat modeling, understand your training needs, things like that. We can do your compliance assessment for various different requirements. We can build a program around what it takes to maintain that compliance over time, not just hit a single point in time goal. And we can help with any of your FedRAMP objectives that you have going forward.
And with NowSecure, as I've talked here, we're kind of full service offering. We've got the training, the testing, the automated security testing, and so forth. And what we're really focusing on from a DevSecOps perspective is the notion of security automation, right? So if you can drive security automation through the entire life cycle, our customers report they release 30% faster. Why do you want to release faster? It's usually because you're trying to make money off your mobile app. So you get that speed, you're making more money faster. You're getting new innovative features out that can help you monetize faster, or there may be other economic metrics related to the mobile applications you're shipping. Compressing testing and delivery costs, 30% is generally conservative. We've had people report that numbers like 60, 70%. Especially if they're going from kind of a manual periodic model into a continuous scenario. I'll tell you about one of them in a minute. And of course, this is all about reducing risk. Now, none of our customers fix everything they find. We all have risk tolerance, and we'll make some decisions that are economic and risk-based decisions on how hard is it to fix, how critical is the severity, and so on and so forth. But if you can cut your risk in half, that's a big deal. So you're talking about higher quality software delivered faster, meeting the revenue or other business performance goals. That's what we want to get to. And with Coalfire and NowSecure together, you get the best of both worlds. You get automation in the pipeline, you get the pen testing and compliance you need, and you get it for web and mobile. So as we roll forward here, Zoom controls in the wrong way. Tell us a little bit about a case study here. Let's look at an example of an organization.
Yeah, this is a great interview with a healthcare provider who was explaining as he came aboard as CISO what it meant to build a custom program for his organization. His leadership had different requirements. His business had very different requirements than some of his experience. And he had to build a different program to outline against that. Of course, he wanted to move everything as early in the process, but what did that mean for the folks that he was managing there? And I won't spoil any of the details, but it beats again on that drum that we're speaking of here of find your own path forward. It's not going to be implementing every single metric we had a few slides ago. It's picking the ones that you know your team can deliver on, you know you can build a story from, and you can use that story to help management understand the risks in your organization so you get more funding, more runway, more whatever you need going forward to build more security in earlier.
So some resources.
Yeah, these are some of the things that we put out there. Again, as consultants, we see a lot of different organizations that give us a lot of different data on the state of security in the greater world around us. So we see large providers and their high level of maturity. We see small providers with very high level of maturity and everything in between. And this goes and tries to quantify some of that so you can have some pretty charts and graphs to understand what the bigger picture is of some of these things in the world around us.
All righty, so I'll share a little bit about NowSecure. And when you look at each of these different case studies, they have something in common. How do I manage my risk while accelerating my cycle? And how do I do it in a way that developers will accept security or embrace security in the process? So whether it's financial institution on the left, where they want 10-minute fast, rapid remediation cycles, Caribou Coffee is a great example of moving from a quarterly release cycle to a monthly release cycle to a bi-weekly release cycle. And Allstate is a fully automated, high-running, metrics-driven pipeline. It's a phenomenal internal case study for them as well. And so when we've got a few resources for you here, I mentioned before the free training. So academy.nowsecure.com is free. You can sign up today, take any of the training in it. If you're here, you're already learning. We have training courses for developers to learn secure coding skills. We have training courses for pen testers and QA teams to learn how to do security testing. Now, when we work with organizations, I was just with a group this week doing some training, and they were all web people. They're web developers, and there were web pen testers, and they were both wanting to learn their way through mobile security. So we've got resources for you on that, as well as some resources on how to build a DevSecOps pipeline from a mobile perspective. So take advantage of those links. Now, I want to give a quick shout out. We've got our twice annual Connect event is coming up on April 12th. Stranger Bones is what we rebranded it as last year. And if you're a fan of the show, you'll come and have fun. So Stranger Bones Rewind is the best of last year's content and a couple of really cool new things, including policy-driven DevSecOps, including the latest OWASP releases and some other cool surprises. So we encourage you to sign up for that. You can experience it live, and there's replays available as well. So come join us for Stranger Bones Rewind. So we've got a couple questions in. Reminder, the Q&A is open, and I'm going to go ahead and open the Q&A tab and see what we have here. Oh, this is great. So this is going to come to you, Warren. So we talked a lot about metrics and data. Question is, how do you deal with leadership that only wants metrics and wants to see them get better and better?
This is a tricky one. I've seen this one inside. I've seen this as a consultant, and it's a matter of understanding what you're measuring and why you're measuring it, and telling the story of how you intend it to change over time. So at the beginning, they're just going to want to know that they see a number of vulnerabilities. They want that to go down. Well, if you're just starting your program and you're early in your life cycle, that number's going to go up before it goes down. And that's an important part of the story to tell before those charts hit those executive dashboards. Understand with your leadership directly and the executives above you that you're telling the story of we are a maturing organization. We are aggressively trying to change the practices and policies. Here's the ways we're doing it. Here's what we expect to see in the metrics. Just like financial folks predict the performance of a business quarter over quarter, you want to have that story to be told ahead of your metrics when it gets in front of those folks who aren't the practitioners. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's a awkward conversation to have if you're not prepared for it and trying to learn it the hard way.
I get it. Let me see. The next one in is, oh, this is interesting. How do you get developers to pay attention to OWASP standards? I'll take that one since I brought up OWASP before. So Both our businesses, we embrace industry standards as the right way to do things, right? Whether it's a compliance perspective, if you have to meet PCI or FedRAMP, or whether it's an industry standard like OWASP, which really is the ultimate in best practices for building an AppSec program, web, mobile, API. They've got new IoT stuff going, Cyclone DX for SBOM. So there's a really interesting thing when you say, I want a developer to go learn about an application security testing standard. And the trick with that is to change the conversation and say, this will give you security requirements that are well recognized and vetted by the biggest companies in the world, fast-moving banks, companies like Netflix and Amazon, and so on and so forth, participate in this. So it's really the best collection of what the industry agrees matters. And in the mobile world, for example, where I'm deeper than the web world, the MASVS has sections in it for developers. What does secure storage mean? So what should you be doing as a developer with secure storage or secure network? So it's a great learning tool. So think of it this way. Developers tend to like cookbooks. So if you think of it as a cookbook to help them with the recipe and say, hey, here's a few chapters you can read. They're not very long. They're just like reference lookup materials. Let's get started. Or you can go through our OWASP class. The developer coding classes that we have use the OWASP stuff. They may or may not know it, but the facts there are going to make that work.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to tie in on that because I've had tremendous success in my career doing that. And using that, as I spoke about earlier, is that bridge to build a new relationship. If you sit down with application folks with the MSASVS or just the ASVS, you can evaluate, or you can have security champions evaluate with the owners, the architects, the developers. What are we doing great today? Let's chart that against the industry. Is that actually great? Where are our opportunities in the future, and how can we put those into the roadmap? Many years ago, we used that for pushing out things like removing default credentials, adding in higher levels of TLS, adding in more secure assumptions earlier in the life cycle. And that was how we got to meet developers. It's how we got to meet architects. It's how we got to get into those committee meetings. We say, look, we want to proactively meet compliance objectives by using the ASVS as our roadmap. And that's a really, really good opportunity. You don't have to do all the research to understand what the top performing level is. You go pull down those standards, you look at that top level, and you start trying to get there day by day, change by change.
Absolutely. So we got time for one more. I think we both have some answers to this. I'll give you a chance to go first. What role does traditional pen testing play in the DevSecOps world?
Oh, this one's my favorite. It sounds like Brian, I came in through QA at one point or another, and also as a sysadmin. So I was responsible for dealing with a lot of those reports. The best thing I've done in my career that I encourage folks to do, if you have an external party, you have a customer, you have a client who's handing over those reports, take them in and use them as a detailed roadmap for your own training. This is your application. This is your environment. They use techniques and practices you may not have incorporated into your life cycle. Learn to train everyone on those processes. Learn to train everyone on those mindsets. What are they doing differently that our testers aren't doing? This is really a quick cheat sheet to a long-term consulting gig of how do we find and one-up our testing? We have answers. We have problems that we have fixed or have on our roadmap to fix, hopefully. Now we can make our training reflect that to avoid any of these sort of findings in the future.
So it's a great question to think about pen testing. And we've had this interesting challenge where we advocate for automated security testing. And if someone's really sophisticated in understanding security, they'll ask you questions like, well, can you automate things like authentication in the pipeline if I'm using multi-factor or biometric authentication as an example of something that's really incredibly hard? So over the past year, we've been evolving, and our goal was to say, if the goal is a fully automated pen test in the pipeline that runs in 15 minutes, can you actually do that? Well, we all know a pen test with a human takes way longer than 15 minutes. A lot of planning and execution goes into it. So what we've done is our findings and test engine is actually driven by our pen testers. So we've taken 10 years of doing mobile pen testing, some 11,000 mobile pen tests, and built a cookbook for our pen testing team. And we handed that to our engineering team and said, how many of these can you build an automated test for? And so what we've got now is we're able to do about 70%, sometimes 80% of an automated pen test, quote unquote. I don't want to claim I have an automated pen test. And then you got that last 20% mile. How do you get that last mile of the manual stuff? So we created a technique we call guided testing. What it basically means is the automation runs, and then an expert pen tester steps in and takes particular steps that are not automatable within the DevSecOps lifecycle. So literally, I can run an automated test. Those findings will be routed to the developer. Then a routing goes to a pen tester that says, these are the 3 gaps that I wasn't able to automatically test. The pen tester logs in and does their thing. And within an hour, any other findings are fed back into the pipeline. And so this guided testing model where you have full automation and an expert guided pen test is a way we're able to get to continuous pen testing. So we have customers that would do automated testing every day, and then they might add the guided test every release cycle, right? To get those extra edge case things. And you can add extra guided testing if you have new features you want to explore and so on and so forth. So we've really tried to mash the two together to get as close as you can to it. And it's not that we don't believe in pen testing. What we believe in is speed. So if you can use automation to get a lot of the grunt work done, and then you've got the humans to do the most efficient parts, the remaining parts, and they don't have to do the redundant work that the machine already did, that's kind of 1 + 1 = 3 that makes them all run faster. So this was a really great session today. Warren, thank you so much for joining. Do you have some closing words for the folks?
Not really. If you have consulting needs, come and find us at Coalfire. We're happy to do business with you. We're happy to learn what your challenges are and help you execute on the future. Thank you very much, Brian. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's
great having you, Warren. The data's awesome. Coalfire has been a great partner, and Coalfire tests our stuff too. So we love you as a vendor. So NowSecure, we are here for you on all things mobile AppSec, and we will be back next month with DevSecOps Bunch, and we're going to be talking mHealth and very specific requirements for fast-moving pipelines in a regulated healthcare scenario. With some folks from Volar. It's going to be really cool. I really enjoy working with those folks. So thank you again to Warren and the Coalfire team. Reminder, you will get a copy of the recording and a link to the slides within a couple of days. Any of the questions that we didn't answer, we will follow up through email with the folks who asked them. And I wish you all a great week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.